Good evening. The Chief Executive of the NHS says the service is facing what he calls unprecedented levels of pressure. Sir Alan Langlands told the BBC that hospitals were coping well in the circumstances, which were the worst for 25 years. His comments followed a row over the number of intensive care beds available, with doctors' groups saying there's no sign of the 100 extra beds promised in England this winter.
It's here in intensive care where the winter pressures on the NHS are most starkly apparent, even though the government's funded an extra 100 beds, some for the most sick in intensive care and others for high dependency patients. Doctors say there's no proof that these beds actually exist because there's been no improvement on past years.
We know that the government have funded 100 extra beds for intensive care, but the Society's worried that those beds are not actually intensive care beds in a tangible manner. We don't know whether they're high dependency beds or whether they really are intensive care beds.
As hospitals continue to deal with the extra winter workload, NHS managers say there was no extra money earmarked for more intensive care beds. They've had to compete with other demands.
Well, we've certainly planned for a substantial increase in the number of intensive care beds. So if you like, the plans are there on paper. But we haven't actually been able to fully implement all of those plans everywhere because of the financial and service pressures that the NHS is under.
This latest row over intensive care beds is yet another example of a service stretched to the full. The government insists the additional beds do exist. A quarter went to intensive care and the rest to help high dependency patients. But a short time ago, the head of the NHS admitted that the health service is experiencing the worst pressures in more than 2 decades.
We have been under enormous pressure. I've worked in the health service for 25 years. I think these are unprecedented levels of pressure. And certainly that has revealed shortcomings in the service. We have tried very hard to make these right over the last couple of years. We'll continue to develop and improve the health service as resources are made available to do so.
All week, the Conservatives have been attacking the government over their use of NHS figures. They say the latest row over intensive care beds is yet another example of Labour manipulating information for their own gain.
They talk about the availability of critical care beds when we've been asking about intensive care beds, and even when beds are available, they're not staffed and therefore not available for patients. It's time that ministers started telling us the truth.
The Liberal Democrats, who were holding a strategy meeting in London today, say there has to be a calm assessment of what the NHS really needs.
Somebody needs to give an independent assessment of need and an independent count of beds. And it is always better to have 10% spare at your time of greatest need than 10% too few.
Nursing shortages in intensive care means that from day to day, though beds might be vacant, they can't be used. This, say doctors, also should be addressed. It's been a week when the government's commitment to the NHS has been severely bruised by opposition MPs and the medical profession. But tomorrow it'll be the Prime Minister who takes centre stage when he insists that health remains a priority. Karen Allen, BBC News, Westminster.
French detectives have staged a reconstruction of the murder of the British student Isabelle Peake. Her body was found beside a railway line in central France last October. The police threw a dummy from a train to try to discover exactly how Isabelle fell onto the track.
It was on this stretch of line that Isabelle Peake died, and today, using a carefully constructed dummy, police are trying to establish whether the Birmingham University student was pushed, whether she jumped trying to escape her attacker, and indeed whether it was possible for one person acting alone to have thrown someone else out of a train window. The policeman in charge of today's reconstruction said they were also looking at what effect the fall at 80 miles an hour would have had. Sid Ahmed Rizala, the prime suspect for this and 2 other murders, was arrested in Portugal this week and is resisting extradition moves. Although this elaborate reconstruction might appear bizarre, macabre even, police are hoping that by staging it, they'll shed more light on the events leading up to Isabelle Peake's death and also answer criticisms that they've been slow to respond in this inquiry. The actual train sits in a siding in Limoges, the doors sealed. But it was a week before it was taken out of service because police never made the link between the discovery of a body and Isabelle Peake's parents reporting her missing.
Le cadavre d'Isabelle Peake avait été retrouvé.
At a news conference this afternoon, the examining magistrate said they'd learnt a lot, but wouldn't make public the conclusions until the end of the month. Isabelle Peake was last seen alive with Syed Ahmed Rizala. What police are hoping that today's reconstruction will achieve is to give them more than just circumstantial evidence against their prime suspect. John Sopel, BBC News, Chabanais.
The Moors murderer Myra Hindley is said to be making satisfactory progress after being treated for a potentially fatal brain condition. Hindley was taken to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge 2 days ago with a swollen artery at the base of her brain. She's said to be in a stable condition. Russian forces have carried out one of their heaviest attacks on rebel positions in Chechnya since the war began nearly 4 months ago. In the past 24 hours, there are thought to have been more than 180 bombing raids by Russian warplanes on the capital Grozny and mountain villages in southern Chechnya.
The war in Chechnya is getting bloodier. Now it's clear the toll of the dead and injured from the last week's fighting is much higher than was thought, perhaps many hundreds. The Russians are pushing forward. They say they're taking the war into its final phase. But as the troops retook this village near Shali, they came to a place which they've turned into a wasteland. This woman is a witness. When the rebels came, she says, the Russians rained shells down on us. No mercy is now the watchword of the Russian troops. They're searching from house to house, but find mostly only rubble. The rebels have melted back into the hills, vowing they'll soon be back. Those who suffer most are the weak, the very old, and the defenseless. For them, there's no medicine and little hope. The Chechens claim they still hold Grozny. This is Russia's answer, the fiercest onslaught on the city yet. Protests are mounting from the outside world that levelling a whole city is against the rules of war. But Russia, in angry mood, wants to win at any cost. William Worsley, BBC News, Moscow.
A man has been arrested after a car crashed into the security gates at Downing Street. Neither the Prime Minister nor the Chancellor were at home at the time, and a government spokesman said there had been no breach of security. A mother and her child were slightly injured and are being treated in hospital.
The aftermath of the incident and no obvious signs of damage to the gates after the car crashed into them. It was quickly removed. The driver was arrested, a small child and a woman were injured.
I saw the lady fly in the air. She must have flown up several feet from where I saw her. And I saw the police jump onto the bonnet of the car. One kicked the windscreen. Two of them were frantically pulling at the passenger and driver's side doors. They pulled the man out eventually. About 6 policemen sat him down.
Detectives now need to establish whether this was an accident or something more sinister.
A Downing Street spokeswoman has stressed security here wasn't breached by this incident, and she said the Prime Minister and his family weren't at home at the time.
The wrought iron gates were installed to protect Margaret Thatcher, particularly from terrorist attack. Some derided them as an eyesore. But in 1992, the IRA evaded the security measures by firing a mortar bomb from this van, which landed in the garden of number 10. It highlighted the building's potential vulnerability.
Obviously, Downing Street is a potential target for many people, not necessarily organised people, but many people may have a grudge against government and therefore Downing Street, so therefore it's constantly watched.
The Vauxhall car, which was damaged after it hit the gates, has been examined by the police. Its driver is still being questioned. Peter Hunt, BBC News, Downing Street.
Cricket now, and play was abandoned on the second day of the final test between England and South Africa in Pretoria without a ball being bowled. A heavy downpour at Centurion Park put paid to any hopes of a resumption today. South Africa will resume their first innings tomorrow on 155 for 6. And that's it from me for now. The late news tonight is at 10:15. Have a very good evening. Bye-bye.